what I'll say is I wanted to, so welcome everyone, welcome everyone. So my name is Abhinay Muttu. I'm a visiting professor at the Meghnad Desai Academy of Economics in Mumbai, but I'm right now in London. And I'm an academic, a professor, spent most of my career in UK universities. It's a real pleasure to be here in general, to be with you all. But in particular, I was making the point to Vikrant earlier on that in particular, because Meghnad Desai, who was my teacher at the London School of Economics when I was an undergraduate, long time ago, is his academy. He set it up. He and his colleagues set it up 8-9 years ago. The academy here, and I was aware that Ruya College is where he was an undergraduate himself. So it's quite a poignant moment that here I am teaching or giving a seminar to the college where my mentor, my teacher, was an undergraduate himself. So it's quite an interesting moment for my. I'll mention it to him. I'm on email with him. I'll drop him an email. I gave a talk to his college, to his undergraduate college. So it's very nice to be here. While others are joining, let me say what I'm planning to do. The title of this webinar is The Art and Science of Negotiation. And while others are coming still, what I will say is that my plan is to, will be within an hour, that I will spend half the time, so about 25 minutes, I will speak on the subject. And then I want to use the second half of this hour, the remaining the 25, 30 minutes, continuing the conversation with you all through Q&A session. And this is a really important part of the session. I don't like lecturers, teachers, professors who just monotone give lectures. It's very important to get the students engaged. And so I'm going to use the webinar in the same format. So those of you here, hopefully you're not shy, the students. You will think about the kind of questions you want to ask me on the subject or related, and we'll continue the conversation in this webinar that way as well. It'll be more fun, and it'll be also something that hopefully you'll get more out of than me just giving a 1-hour talk. And what we'll do is what I will suggest, if you're thinking about it, I would ideally prefer that when you're asking questions, just unmute yourself and come on the screen and ask the question. That's the most efficient way to do it. Put your video on as well if you like. But if you don't like putting a video on, don't like speaking, you put it in the chat box and I can try to read, or Professor Vikrant can help me through the chat box, put your question to. That's the plan as I will begin now. So let me begin my remarks. As I said, 20-25 minutes, I'll give a little remarks on this subject. So the first thing I want to observe is that I want to make the observation that the world is burning right now. It's burning. Literally in some parts of the world, like in Ukraine, there's a war happening there, and therefore that country with the Russia and Ukraine having a big war there. So the world there is literally burning. The other parts of the world, thankfully, it's not literally burning, but it's burning nonetheless. For example, in the UK right now, we have as you must be aware, we have a prime minister of Indian origin, British Indian origin, and he's facing big trouble right now at home in England due to strikes. Today, the ambulance workers are on strikes, the rail union workers are on strikes, the teachers are on strikes. Almost every public sector worker is on strike. And again, it's causing problems in the UK in terms of people getting on their business, going to work, going to hospital appointments, and so on and so forth. So in some sense, even the country is in a bit of a situation. I call it burning in some sense, not burning literally, but burning metaphorically. And I can go on and give you other examples. What was happening in Brazil? We had a change of government there from Bolsonaro to Lula. Lula's left guy, and there was a storming of the parliament, like what happened in the US 2 years ago. And we can go on and give you lots of examples around the world where we're going through turbulence. The world is going through turbulence. In India as well, I can give lots of examples. I'm sure you can give examples of turbulence, of what I call world is burning. And in this context, it is ever more important for economists, for social scientists, more generally, to think about how do we cooperate more. We need more cooperation, better cooperation. This is the heart of economics and social science, is how can we secure cooperation? Throughout human history, we have progressed to the point where we have because of we have been able to cooperate. Yeah, how we organize society. There's peace, relatively speaking, today across the world compared to 400 years ago. But a great book for you to read, really a plain English book by a great economist called In the Company of Strangers. I think along that, Paul Seabright, In the Company of Strangers. It's a great, beautiful, it was a bestseller. It came out 15 years ago, something like that. Tells the story, it's by an economist, tells the story of human story, of how from the beginning of time we have arrived in where we have in terms of lots of progress, lots of growth, lots of prosperity, but it's all because we as strangers, that's why it's called in the Company of Strangers, we as strangers have been able to cooperate for mutual benefit. Whether cooperation by how, when you organize business, when you organize a firm, when you sell and buy, you're cooperating. In that context, what is key is that we need to negotiate. So negotiations are left, right, and center. You're negotiating every day, even though when you don't believe it, when you don't realize it. And we negotiate explicitly. For example, right now in the Ukraine context, there's a big debate happening. Should we negotiate? Shouldn't we negotiate? Should we or shouldn't we negotiate with Putin to arrive at peace? And there's a big debate about that. Negotiations happen all the time in the arena of politics between different political parties. Rahul Gandhi, for example, is thinking about how can I win the next election? He needs to form a coalition, perhaps, with other parties, and that requires negotiation. In the economic space, negotiation happening all the time between businesses when they're thinking of merging or not merging, or when they're buying and selling stuff, and so on and so forth. In the marketplace, when you go to a bazaar, you're negotiating on the price of whatever it is you want to buy. And in the social context, one is negotiating as well all the time. So negotiations have always been there, and we as people negotiate in different contexts. It's obviously great to be a great negotiator. In fact, I would say we are hardwired to negotiate. If we believe in evolution, that we are the product of evolution, then the evolutionary process of millions of years, billions of years, has made us hardwired to be negotiators. Got to negotiate our way to find food in the olden times, so on and so forth. In economics, by the way, in economic theory, last 50 years, starting from John Nash, we started thinking scientifically about negotiations. John Nash, the famous John Nash, the Nash equilibrium, which is a core concept in economics, social sciences. He was the architect behind the theory, the science, if you like, of negotiation. And again, if you Google me, you will see I know a lot about this stuff. You'll Google me, you'll see a lot of papers. There's a good paper on my website. If you want to read further on this subject, on the science of it, please go ahead or email me and I can send you the link. In that context, one of the hardest bits is not the science of negotiation. The science meaning that, how does it work? How do we become better negotiators? How do we reach a deal? Right? Because in negotiation, the issue is, do we reach a deal or not? Do we stop the strikes? Do we stop the war? Do we stop divorce? Do we stop conflict? And how do we how do we do that? But the second issue is, besides that question of efficiency, to do with, do we reach a deal or not? Do we strike a deal or not? Do we negotiate to peace or not? It's also about who gets what. So the two central questions, which of course lie at the heart of economics, is one is efficiency, other is distribution. Because the reason why for example, go back to Ukraine as my example, so it's a burning example. The reason why they're not reaching a deal is because the question of what the deal will look like. Who gets what? Are we going to trade land for peace? The Ukrainians don't want to do that. The West doesn't want to do that. And there are different views on that. So who gets what is exactly that. Just give you another example of the negotiation conflict is inflation. Inflation can be thought of as a conflict between the capitalists and the workers. And the issue is, I won't go into the details of that, but the question is, Marx talked about it. The conflict between workers and capitalists at some level is about reaching a deal, negotiating. How do we organize society and reach a peace? And we have peace in society, but the conflict is who gets what. Yeah, what the wage is a conflict between how much of the cake is kept by the capitalist in profit and how much is given to the worker for his labor. So you will, if you look at it, if you take my glasses, or take my glasses metaphorically, you will see and look at the world out there, you will see it's all basically a negotiation. And the question is, do we reach a deal or not? If we don't reach a deal, are we going to fight? And if we reach a deal, what does the deal look like? Who gets what? And there's a large literature, as I pointed out, looking at the science of it. I'll give you one example in a minute. But before I give you one example to illustrate what we're thinking about, I just want to make the point, this area is still a huge territory which needs to be explored. And one area which has totally unexplored is the role of emotions. Role of emotions on negotiation. Role of about behavior, because behavior, how we behave in negotiation, is influenced by emotions. Are we angry with this individual? Revenge. These are concepts which economics doesn't factor in. And I just want to point out to all the students, but otherwise, that while we understand the science of negotiation to some extent, we don't really understand the art of negotiation. And the reason why deals are not reached, why there's so much conflict still in the world, is because we are not robots. We are human beings with emotions. And we as economists, social scientists, do not know how to think about how emotions impact on behavior. I'll park that area. I might come back to later on. Let me step back to talk about some of the science, one or two elements of science. One of the things, by the way, people tell me, Abhinay, how do I get a pay rise? What do I do? How do I go to my boss and say, I want a pay rise? And I tell them that one of the most important insights that we discovered and studied over the last 50 years was the role of outside options. Outside options. What that means is that when you're negotiating on whatever it is you're negotiating, what matters is how good is your alternative if you don't reach a deal. Okay, so if you're negotiating with once you get your job and you're negotiating a pay rise with your employer, and you're trying to say, look, I want more money, I want a higher wage, then you need to be able to say that if I don't get a higher wage, I'm going to walk and I'm going to go and get a better job elsewhere. So your better job elsewhere is your outside option. Let me give you another example to do with women empowerment. Another example. So one of the big issues across the world, but also in particular in India, rural India in particular, that women get a bad deal in the household. It is well known, a lot of data out there to point out that they get a bad deal in terms of they're doing all the work, they're getting the last, they eat last, they don't get the choicest meat, it goes to the man and stuff like that. They get a bad outcome. So the question to ask, how do we improve that? How do we improve the outcome that occurs in a household, in a marriage? And because you can't be monitoring, you can't have the Prime Minister Modi cannot be sending, keeping monitoring and saying to the man, look, give a better deal here. That's not how it works. So we've got to think about how do we empower? How do we give more bargaining power, if you like, to the women, to the woman in a marriage, so that she can get a better deal herself through a negotiation? Because implicitly, there's a negotiation happening. Sometimes explicitly, there's a negotiation happening between the two spouses on who does what, who's going to do the cleaning, who's going to wash the dishes and stuff like that, who's going to work, and where are we going to work, and so on and so forth. So a negotiation between the spouses is happening all the time. And what I would say to the Prime Minister, if he was asking my advice, is that what you need to do is to increase the outside option of the woman. What I mean by that is that, she should be able to tell the other party, her spouse, look, I need a better deal, otherwise I'm walking. And he will say, you're going to walk, where are you going to go, right? So what you need to do is she needs to, for example, her outside option would be her market wage. That if she were to leave, if a divorce occurs, that she's able to get a great job elsewhere. And for that to happen, she needs to be educated big time. So therefore, my advice to the Prime Minister would be to increase the woman's bargaining power in a marriage. Educate women of India. And that way, you're going to increase the bargaining power indirectly. By the way, this idea that I'm pointing out to you there's literature on this stuff. The World Bank talked about this stuff. Again, so it's not nothing. I'm not telling you something new about that. By giving you another example of what an outside option does. There are one other example I'll give you of a force that drives bargaining power, that drives, what determines what happens in negotiation, has to do with risk aversion. Right now, for example, they're going back to the easy example of Ukraine war. Right now, they're not reaching a deal because both parties are willing to take a risk and let the war continue, and are less averse to risk. The question is, who's willing to wait longest? Yeah, who's willing to risk more bad stuff? So the party that's less averse to risk has a stronger bargaining power. So again, the question as a policymaker might be, well, how do we make someone less averse to risk? Human beings by nature are averse to risk. You don't want uncertainty. You don't want bad stuff to happen. But given that, you're at a disadvantage in terms of bargaining leverage. And again, so I don't have time to go tell you more about this theory of science of negotiations, but I'm just giving you a feel of some of the factors that drive bargaining power, that determine whether a deal is reached. Just one final point on information. Now, one of the things you must have studied in economics is the famous paper by George Akerlof, The Lemon Market for Lemons. In that paper, he points out that when parties, traders have asymmetric information, meaning that one party has more information about the stuff compared to the other party, that the seller knows the quality of what he's selling, whether it's milavat in the rice or not, only the seller knows. So the buyer does not know, so there's asymmetric information. Then markets might collapse. No trade may occur. In a similar vein, the reason why one major decisive factor for why agreement is not reached in the Ukraine war, why divorces happen, why strikes happen, is because the parties have asymmetric information. So, for example, again, using Ukraine as an example, that people don't know whether Putin is really tough or not, whether he's really going to be assassinated in Russia or not, right? These are kind of questions they're not sure. So this asymmetric information implies that you keep on fighting. Why are strikes happening? Strikes are a way to credibly signal to the other party that I'm tough. So asymmetric information is a factor that leads to disagreement, that leads to delay, strikes, wars, conflict. And therefore, you can see what the policy implication is, that we've got to find a way to reduce asymmetric information. And one way of doing that, by the way, is trying to enhance trust. How do you raise trust? Trust is an important concept which we don't teach much in economics, but it's a foundation for social order, for markets to function. In a similar way, building trust. So one of the things that, how do we build trust when people are fighting and not negotiating in a good faith? And you might think, hey, let's get together. In the olden days, I have a project on this, reading anthropology, they used to have big feast. So let's stop the war. Like France and England used to be on fighting, and they used to stop the war and have a big feast. Let me conclude my remarks by talking about the frontier of this area. The frontier meaning where new stuff is happening that requires further study, further research to understand better how we negotiate, how we reach deals, and how we reach relatively fair deals. And that frontier for me is understanding better human behavior, because when negotiations are done by human beings, but not done by robots, at least not yet, there'll always be human beings making decisions, negotiating, whether to compromise, how much to compromise. And one of the factors, I go back to the point I made earlier on, is to do with human emotion. So human emotions, when you're deciding whether you want to reach a deal, whether you want to, when your parent wants to give you a bit more money than less allowance, it's to do with emotion. The parent is not doing a rational calculation. Well, if I give this more money than the child will, or you will do something or the other. There's a bit of that happening. Of course, there's calculations happening in the back of both parties' mind, but it's also, there is about, there's love. How do I feel about, how do I feel about the situation? How do I feel about the other party? Do I trust other party? So what we economists are really bad at, is better incorporating how emotions impact behavior, and in turn, how they impact our likelihood to reach a deal, to say yes. And I would invite all of you to think hard about this. Again, the reason why we are unable to do that is because, in a way, even the biologists, even the neuroscientists are still trying to understand how the brain works, what exactly are emotions. So it's not as if, we just take it off the shelf and we incorporate it. It's not so simple. But that's why we need creativity and innovative thinking. But how does one think about in a systematic way about how emotions impact on behavior and outcomes? And of course, at the same time as we, all the people must be playing around with Chat GPT. This AI new tool is a real breakthrough in AI, and that's going to impact not just on everything we do, but also on how we negotiate. It'll be an additional tool. It's not going to replace human beings, but it could be an additional tool. So again, another frontier is how is technology, the use of technology, Chat GPT, and the refinements of Chat GPT over the next year or so. How do these tools influence how we reach deals? And so, if you're thinking about, this is so important, a question for humanity. It's the core of human condition. You need to think about how is technology to be used? For example, take how we do politics, how we organize society, how we do government. The role of technology, it's all about negotiation. In fact, someone said to me the other day, one of my co-authors at Harvard Government said, politics is just a negotiation. And he is damn right, absolutely spot on. It's one big negotiation. Let me pause here. We're coming to 12 o'clock, to my 12, so it's your 5:30, halfway line. What I'm proposing to do, as I said, I can continue talking. What I'm going to do is, someone is okay. I see. So what I want to do, I want to continue the conversation by you guys asking questions, and I would say that ideally just unmute yourself. But what I see here, I think I can see it in the chat box. Raise your hand for any question. I will allow you to unmute yourself. So I think this is Prasad. So yeah, go ahead and raise your hands, and my colleague Prasad will be able to see you raise your hands and will unmute you, so you can then ask your question yourself. That's more fun way to do it. So let's do it that way. So raise your hand if you would like to ask a question. And of course, if you don't want to if you don't want to unmute yourself, I'm looking at raise hand. No one's raising hands. While you're thinking what you want to ask, if you want to just basically ask a question in the chat box, feel free to do that, and I can try to read it, or Professor Vikrant can help me do that. So that's where we are. And while you're thinking about, I don't know whether I went too fast, whether you were hearing what I was saying. I hope you heard some of it, not all of it. Also, I know my accent is not completely Indian, although I'm Indian, obviously. Hopefully you can ask, your questions can be, your questions don't have to be exactly in response to my comments. It's about negotiations more generally. And so feel free to ask questions. Okay, chat will have, no question on the chat box. So yeah, feel free. If not, I can continue talking. And while you're thinking about what you want to ask, I will say a few more things. As you're thinking. So basically, I'm just talking, not because I don't want you to raise your hand if you want to ask a question. Okay, I'm going to just offer some few other examples while you're thinking whether you want to ask a question and what the question is. So when you're thinking about negotiation, especially in, let's say, for example, in the current political context in India, one of the things is that we got lots of parties, and right there, you one way, even in Maharashtra, parties typically will be negotiating deals amongst each other. The one very interesting question, by the way, is in political science negotiation, is that there's a question coming up, is that there's a question come out. I'll read the question in a minute. Is that should the parties negotiate with each other before the elections or after the election result? That's a very interesting question. Should you reach a deal between two parties, A and B, to then announce the deal? That if we win, we will share. You'll get the transport ministry, I'll get the prime ministership, and so on and so forth. Should we do that before the election result, so without knowing what the result is, or do you do that ex post? And of course, there's an interesting question in terms of what's better for the party, for the parties. And so that's an interesting question if you're interested in studying this. There's a question that's come through which says, how do you build confidence while negotiating in a big group? That's a big question. Anonymous attendee. Okay, so basically, this is a question from an anonymous attendee. How do you build confidence while negotiating in a big group? So there's a lot. I'm going to break it up. So confidence, by the way, confidence is, confidence is a really important point. Is a very important thing to have, and I would, it gives you the ability to walk into a room with your head high and succeed. So confidence, success, huge correlation, even causal effect. Now, in terms of the question, which I'm not sure, while you're negotiating in a big group, so while you're negotiating, of course, if you negotiate, there's a question of whether you can build a rapport more than confidence, but also could be confidence while you're negotiating behind closed doors or in front of journalists. What are the mechanisms through which you build confidence while you're negotiating? Ideally, you want to build confidence before you go to negotiation, but you can, of course, build confidence while you're negotiating. Very good point. And I think the building of confidence is trying to be bold, be imaginative, take leadership. One of the things I would say to anyone who's negotiating, whether it's a high-level political leader, to right the way to in the concept of firm, is that one of the great things about negotiation is to be creative and imaginative in terms of offering, in terms of what you offer, in terms of how you're going to negotiate. Now, the question goes on in a big group. I'm not sure whether a big group with climate crisis, for example, whether it's so in a climate crisis context, there is in the climate in the climate crisis, every year there's a climate negotiation across countries. That's a big group, and again, confidence in a big group is harder, I guess, because you've got other people who are watching. So I don't know whether you, the anonymous attendee, whether you were thinking in that way, that in a big group, building confidence. If you're not a very confident person, and say you're a small country or whatever country in 180 countries are negotiating or the climate crisis issue, how much to pay, or how much should Americans pay to whatever someone to reduce their carbon, this and that. If you're trying to do it in a big group with 180 countries, you're going to be scared, and therefore you have an opportunity to build confidence. So I would say it's not clear. But going back to your question, I'll give you some remarks, anonymous attendee, to your question. But I would say this question I haven't seen posed before. So my remarks were based on putting things together. But it's something for you to think about. If you want, you can reply what do you think is the answer to that question. Feel free to do that while I invite anyone else. No one else ask any questions. Very interesting. I thought this was Meghnad Desai's Academy. Okay, we've got a question from Suchi. What is essential? Another question, chat box. Okay, here we are. So, we've got a question from Suchi. What is essential for negotiation? You haven't completed your question, I think, Suchi. You don't want to unmute yourself and ask the question? So Suchi is asking, raise your hand. Okay, Prasad, could you unmute Suchi?
Yes, sir.
Thanks. So Suchi, you could be unmuted. So please ask your question.
Am I audible?
You are. We can hear you. Go ahead.
Yes, sir. So my question was, what is a great asset to have while going into a negotiation, and how important is calmness during negotiation?
So very, very good question. Calmness, by the way, straight away is very important. Very important. That said, by the way, just going backwards, calmness. So calmness is very important in general. However, it could be that sometimes to appear agitated, there's a famous Thomas Schelling, the great game theorist, bargaining guy who won the Nobel Prize a few years ago. He made the point that, if someone comes to your door dressed with a suit and says, give me money, you will tell that person, go away. But if someone turns up in your door who's got blood on his face, with a knife in his hand, and he says, give me money, you will give him money. Now, what am I going to draw from that example that Schelling makes is that in a negotiation, calmness is important in general. However, depending on the situation, depending on the circumstance, depending on the negotiation, it may be that you might want to appear angry. Okay? You might want to deliberately, by design, come across, I'm angry with that. Yeah, so you're trying to threaten, if you like, or send a signal. So what I'm trying to point out to you, Sushi, that calmness in general is good, but you got to think about it carefully. What are you trying to convey? By being calm, are you trying to say that, look, I'm okay with a bad deal? So you got to think about it strategically. On top, in terms of goes back to your earlier question, part of your question about the asset. I think, one of the important bits about going to negotiate is to be well prepared. What do I mean by that? People think, what do you mean by that? Information is critical here. So one of the things I would do, whatever the negotiation is, whether it's a small negotiation with your siblings or whatever, or you become the advisor to Prime Minister and he tells you to negotiate with Pakistan on a deal, whatever negotiation, always spend time preparing and finding out as much you can about the other party. Get all the information you can get about the party, what their type is, who are they, who's going to be there, what do they want, what they want. Because once you have clarity and you reduce that asymmetric information, it'll inform your strategy. So the most important asset going into negotiation is in part to be well informed about the other party on stuff that's material. Other thing I would say is, again, depends on what kind of negotiation, is invest in your outside option. By that I mean that before one gets married, going back to the women empowerment example, before the woman in particular, but it applies to a man as well, before you go get married or get a partner, invest in yourself, meaning invest in your education, invest in your outside option, which means that invest in your education. So before you go into partnership, you know that you can walk away down the line. It sounds cold, if things go pear-shaped. So, and you can apply that to a merger. Suppose you're trying to buy something, right? Suppose you want to merge. Always, before you go into a negotiation to do with a merger, make sure you have an alternative. Your outside option is sufficiently powerful that if you need to go to it, you can go to it, and you can use that as leverage in the negotiation. So, information. Prepare yourself, getting all the information you can, as much as you can, and invest in your outside options. Those are two things I would recommend before you go into the negotiation, because those two tools will be powerful ways to increase your leverage. I hope that's helpful to Sushi. Okay, we got a question here from Ganesh. Good evening, sir. To what extent can bluffing be considered ethical? Oh, that's the great. So the question, before I start, the question is, Ganesh, thanks a lot, Sushi, thanks a lot. Ganesh, you want to come up and say it yourself, but if you want, you raise your hand and Prasad will unmute you. But this is a great question where you say, to what extent can bluffing be considered ethical? So about ethics in negotiating. How do we get optimal results during renegotiating terms while a renewal of a contract? Okay, on the first question, by the way, to what extent can bluffing be considered ethical? Listen, if you had said to me, is bluffing part of negotiation? Absolutely it is. Absolutely it is. You've got to bluff, because remember the issue is you want to get a deal, but you want to get a deal that's as good as possible for you. Therefore, you will bluff, provided it's credible. Okay. Of course, if you get caught out, then you're going to get a bad deal. Now, in terms of the ethics of bluffing, that's I don't have, there's no ready-made answer I have on that one there. I know one of the things I would want to say is that in building trust, you need to be ethical, you need to be fair, you have to bargain, you have to negotiate in good faith. So is a bit of bluffing ethical? Fine. It's a question of degree, and life is always a degree, compromise. So a little bit of bluffing about, you're really weak, you've got not a great outside option, but you sort of bluff inside, got a great outside option, bit of lying, bit of bluffing on that. That might be fine initially. It's a question of whether it's a blatant lie. Yeah. So yeah, this again, it depends on the context of the negotiation, by the way. If you're negotiating with your spouse, definitely I would say bluffing is unethical. If you're negotiating with the devil, then maybe it's not ethical, right? So it's a context dependent. But it's a great question, and if you should Google this stuff, whether what people have to say about bluffing in negotiation being ethical or not. On your second question, Ganesh, how do we get optimal results during renegotiation of a contract? Now, again, this is the renegotiation of a contract, renewal of a contract is still a negotiation, but the difference is that there's some history here, right? There's some history here, and with the relationship, because you're renewing the contract, so you already had a contract. So one of the things I would say is that if you're in a long-term relationship with a buyer, seller, whatever it is, and you think about renewing a contract, you want to already have good relations with that individual. You all already want to have built trust with that partner. So when time comes for renewing a contract, there's no hiccups. It's going to be smoothly, right? So that's one thing I would say to anyone in a long-term relationship with a buyer, seller, whatever it is, partner, is that when you're renewing a contract or employer, that is important to have built trust in the first contract before you come to renewal. If the relationship has gone pear-shaped and you're trying to renew a contract with a supplier, it's not going to be great in negotiations. So the optimal results is to get good results for yourself is definitely, I would say, bear in mind that this renewal is going to happen. So you want to invest in the relationship. So when time comes for renewal, that there will be, the other party will be more favorable. So, for example, if you're in employment context, what I mean by that, it will be applied to employment context. You're renewing a contract in an employment contract, in an employment context. And what I would say there is bear in mind, be good to your boss, be nice to your boss, sweet to your boss. Why? Not because you're trying to get something out of the boss now, it's because you're trying to build a rapport so that when time comes for renewal, you get a great deal, new contract. So that's what I would say to your question, Ganesh, in terms of how do I get good results, optimal results during the renegotiation. Okay, so we got some more questions here. Coming from different angles. So this is chat. Okay, now this is in the. Okay, you guys don't want to come unmuted. Okay, fine. Let me come out of the chat. Close the chat box. Okay, the question by Teja Shiri. Good evening, sir. How far, according to you, are ancient Indian texts, e.g., the Artha Shastra, relevant in negotiating today's world? It's funny, Tejeshwari, sorry, I'm not pronouncing your name properly, and I apologize. I feel embarrassed that I can't do that. It's my bad. Sorry about that. What we get today may not be something. Okay. So on your question is, I want to make the following comment. I think there's something else coming out. What I'll make the following comment is that. So I don't know. I haven't read the Artha Shastra. I'm aware of it. In fact, someone was telling me about it at the academy last term, that the Artha Shastra has something to tell us about negotiation. Let me answer the question this way, which is that it's not specific to the Artha Shastra, that negotiations, while economists and John Nash have laid down some particular theory from science, blah blah blah, last 100 years, we have been negotiating since time immemorial. I will not be surprised if great Indian scholars, kings, and so on, and queens, and Chinese, and name it, throughout human history have something really interesting to say about negotiation. In fact, that's one of the great texts that I recommend is this Chinese text to do, it's not negotiation, but it's related. The Art of War is a great text which is recommended now. I'm sure that similarly there are texts, maybe Artha Shastra has something to do with in it as well. But I can't, if I apologize, I can't comment on your question directly, but indirectly I am by saying that I'm pretty sure that there's insight to be gained from reading old texts, Indian texts, absolutely. And in fact, by the way, Teja Shiri, what I would say to you is that please do that. We need new ideas, how to solve the conflicts, the negotiations that we are confronted in this world right now. We need new ideas. And it may be that the way to get new ideas is to go back in history and further ancient history and our culture. Because culture is relevant. So it could be that what they have to say is more pertinent to negotiating in the Indian context. So absolutely fantastic question, but I'm really sorry, I didn't give you any good answer. So good luck with that. Keep on studying. Email me if you have any ideas. I would love to hear any ideas that come out of your reading from the Artha Shastra or other textbooks on negotiating. There's another question from Chaitra, Google. Again, I'm pronouncing it badly. Look at me, a blanket apology for pronouncing your name. The question is, what are don'ts one should keep in mind while engaging in negotiation? I think one of the things that I realized through experience, but also through the studying negotiation, I've studied negotiation for so many years. My PhD was on the subject, is that you got to bargain in good faith. It goes back to someone's earlier point about ethics. So I would say that all said and done, because get a deal is so important, you need to get that deal. To get a deal, you need to bargain in good faith. So therefore, you need to develop trust. And therefore, the don'ts, by the way, would say don't try to be too unethical. Actually, don't be unethical at all, but don't be definitely too unethical. You don't want to come across as a pain in the neck. So the opposite of of building good relations. Don't do the opposite of building good relations. So that's what I would say, because a negotiation, by the way, is a discussion between human beings. Nelson Mandela has this famous quote who said, negotiation is the way to achieve peace and development. And he's so right. Right across India, for example, we have so many, India is such an amazing country, such diverse. And because of diversity, the different cultures, different languages. And how do we negotiate across language, across states? It's a hard problem, but we must. We must find ways to do it. And don't do it by, antagonizing, by lying and cheating and stuff like that. So that's my don't. That's my big point about don't. There's an anonymous, two anonymous attendee. I don't know whether the same anonymous attendee is coming back with more questions, or if it's different, or it's a different anonymous attendee. But nonetheless, I'll read out the question. So this anonymous attendee, same one or different one, says, I believe on what you said, heading your head high and walking a room would build up that confidence that you need. But sometimes during mid-discussions, it happens that we tend to lose our confidence. That's true, and might end up confusing ourselves and the crowd as well, of course. If we can tackle that situation by saying something, so I pretty much feel that confidence would be very important, very, very important, without overthinking that we messed up. Also, thank you very much for your reply. How to negotiate effectively when you do politics. So, yes, you're right. When you are negotiating, what you described, anonymous attendee, what I just read out quickly, is true. That can happen. But you gotta learn, and it's by learning, by doing that, learn to come back. So I've been in a situation where the confidence slightly ebbs down because you say something or whatever it is. You got to stand up and get back on the horse, so to speak, and rebuild your confidence in the negotiation. But I would say, that I'm thinking aloud about it, confidence and negotiating position is really important. Imagine the party sort of says to you, imagine the party says to you that you're not, if you don't come as confident, you're not going to get a good deal. I'm just looking at some more questions. Let me just pause this for a second. I saw there's some more stuff coming on the chat box. 1 second. Or by Vikrant himself. Okay, sorry. Let me just go to Vikrant's question. Okay, okay. What can I? This is getting me talking all the time. Let me get you guys pause. Vikrant, can you ask your questions by unmuting? Prasad, could you unmute? Because otherwise it's me babbling all the time. Let me get Vikrant to ask questions. Let's get you guys to ask questions. About 10, 15 more minutes. Prasad, could you unmute Vikrant, please?
Yeah. Is my voice audible?
It's ridiculous. Go on.
Is my voice audible though?
Yeah. Go on, please.
So my question is about, I think it's a twofold question. So what happens in some cases that things we agree upon today are the things that we might end up disagreeing upon tomorrow. So there is no permanence to things that we negotiate and decide over, right? So as it happened in case of, say, for example, the NATO negotiations or the Paris climate deal, America decided to be a part of the Paris climate deal, and then there was a change in regime. A new president comes in, and then he revises the deal. He withdraws from the deal. So how do we give permanence to negotiations and decisions that we have made? That's one question. And then at times it is right to revise the deal, because you cannot have a permanent solution for certain things. If you want to have a NATO to deal with Russia, then there might be a time when you would want your NATO partners to spend more on their own security, as it was the demand put forth by Trump. So how do we fix this problem?
Okay. By the way, listen, I'm not going to read out questions anymore. Can you, those of you who want to ask questions, raise your hand, and Prasad, could you unmute the people who are raising their hands? Because otherwise this gets monotone me talking. So please, if you want to ask questions, raise your hand. Prasad will unmute you, and then we can ask questions. But let me now comment on Vikrant, your point. So first of all, the point is that the international law, so when you negotiate on anything within a country, you will typically formalize it in a contract, and it'll be enforced by the courts. So in a domestic context, in a country context, the law enforces the negotiation. So there's permanency to it, by the way. Okay, so if I reach a deal with my employer, I can take my employer to a court if they don't honor what has been agreed. So in that sense, there is permanency of a negotiation that is within the jurisdiction, within a country. Of course, you can renegotiate that, or you can ignore it, but then I'll take you to the court, and the court will have redress. Of course, there are issues with that. So even in that context, it is nothing is permanent in that sense. And of course, as you said, you can always want to renegotiate, but that's mutually beneficial renegotiation. That's why, someone made the point about renewal of contract. We might only agree to my contract with Academy for 3 years, and then we renew it because the times have changed, stuff has changed, and all that sort of stuff. Of course, in the international arena, there's no world government, there's no world law. So in the international arena, when countries are negotiating, there's no world authority, there's no world police force that is going to enforce a deal. And therefore, that's a different kettle of fish. The when Paris deal or whatever it is agreed, the enforceability is by international law. There is international law, but international law is not backed up by a police force. And when you arrive at a deal, this goes back to the foundation of this modern state. The state in any country has a monopoly over violence. You should know that. Max Weber, monopoly of violence. So when the employer, does not fulfill their part of the agreement, I will take them to the court. If they don't obey the court will send the police in to get the employer and put them in prison. That's how it works at the state level. But of course, in the international arena, international law is that you reached a deal, you signed an agreement, and therefore you must obey it. Who's going to enforce it? There's no international police to enforce the law. So whether it's Trump or Putin or whatever, they can do what they want. The international arena, by the way, is interesting. Of course, we had more wars, 100 years back. We have less wars because there's different mechanisms for enforcement, to do with enforcement. And that's because, you don't want to break a deal because it looks bad. If you break a deal, no one will ever again want to make a deal with you. Therefore, it's more a reputational considerations that give incentive to countries to honor their deal. But in the international arena, countries are more willing to break those deals than in a domestic context. So because that is what's happening in terms of in terms of permanency, or more than permanency is the enforceability of an agreement. And the reason why now, I think Zelensky does not want to reach a deal. He's worried about enforceability. That even if I reach a deal, the Russians will go away for 1 year and then come back. Who's going to enforce the deal? But of course, as I said, that point doesn't apply in a domestic context when someone has a long-term contract to buy stuff, raw materials from a domestic supplier. The buyer knows that there's a contract. His lawyers will draw up that contract, and therefore there's a contract which can be enforced to the courts. Of course, so the courts can take ages, and therefore there are costs with that. And therefore, even in that context where there's the law, it is costly to get. It's not easy. It's not easily enforced. Therefore, even there are costs of enforcement. So even in a domestic context, you want to think hard. Do you want to reach a deal with X? If X is unscrupulous, if X is going to break the contract, you probably won't, because all the courts can enforce it. It's going to be costly to get it enforced. So the enforcement issue of an agreement is always there, whether in domestic or international. And it's a problem. It's a big issue. One of the big questions in economics, in game theory, is enforceability issue. How do you enforce stuff? And there is, there's a branch of economics which studies that sort of issue. Obviously, draws on law. I don't know, Vikram, whether that's helpful or not, but feel free to come back, because no one is raising their hands. It would be best if people raise their hand. No one's raising their hand. So, Vikram, if you want to come back, feel free to do that.
Yes, sir. Thanks a lot for your time. That means a lot for me and for students and the attendees.